The Seeing and Not Seeing seminar, which is the main sponsor of Charles Hirschkind's visit, explores multiple ways of seeing and not seeing actors, events, and movements, usually conceptualized as coherent and bounded in social and political analysis. We look at the multiple processes, forces, and representations that occur in and around these phenomena out of which they are constituted. So we mean by seeing and not seeing, not that there is another way of seeing that we mean to find, but rather that we're committed to simultaneity, to holding multiple kinds and ways of seeing in view, and learning what emerges from that holding. Seeing and not seeing is not a binary, and I was recently confronted with that interpretation. It's like, oh no, it's not to see or not see. Rather, we mean to hold in view what we might call the conventional, the understood, the bounded actor or force or event in front of our eyes. Climate change or a repressive police force or a social movement, even as we see around and through it. And to illustrate what we mean by this, I'd like to take a little bit of a detour and quote anthropologist Marisol de la Cadena, writing in her book Earth Beings, Ecologies of Practice Across Andean Worlds. In this book, de la Cadena records and reflects upon her conversations with Mariano, an Andean land rights and anti-mining activist and a healer and religious figure. She writes, while it was not my original intention, our conversations revealed how the historical ontology of modern knowledge both enables its own questions, answers, and understandings, and disables as unnecessary or unreal the questions, answers, and understandings that fall outside of its purview or are excessive to it. And Mariano was also within those limits of the historically recognizable as real. But, as he said, not only, a phrase he used when he indicated that our work should not be contained by the documents. Mariano's phrase, not only, and here I continue to quote de la Cadena, challenged these limits and revealed that relative to his world, the world that sees itself as everything, what I'm calling the conventional, the understood, the historiography you usually do, that's me. The world that sees itself as everything was insufficient. Similarly, the tools to learn everything were not enough to learn what Mariano thought I should learn if my intent was to co-labor with him. Events and relations beyond the limit, that which history and other state practices could not contain. And this is what I'm leading to what was most interesting, but because practices with Mariano were never simple, everything, or what considered itself as such, had to be taken seriously as well. So I think that expresses for me the seeing and not seeing impulse to, yes, take seriously whatever the conventional understandings or bounded figures or historiography or anthropology of our present moment enable us to see, not to discount that or to imply that it is misguided completely or unreal, but rather to look toward the not only. When we discussed whom to invite to the Seeing and Not Seeing seminar last year as we emerged from COVID, Charles Hirschkind was at the top of our list. He had to reschedule from last year, and we're thrilled that he is here now. Hirschkind's work, and in particular his path-breaking analysis of sermons, music, embodiment, affect, and sensibility, proceeds directly and innovatively in the directions we in our seminar have only intuited and begun to grapple with. He indeed takes seriously everything, as de la Cadena meant it, and plunges from there into the not only. To state this a bit more formally, Charles Hirschkind is professor of anthropology at the University of California Berkeley. His research interests concern religious practice, media technologies, and emergent forms of political community in the Middle East, North America, and Europe. He gives particular attention to diverse configurations of the human sensorium and the histories, ethics, and politics they make possible. Taking contemporary developments within the traditions of Islam as his primary focus, he has explored how various religious practices and institutions have been revised and renewed both by modern norms of social and political life and by the styles of consumption and culture linked to global mass media practice. His first book, The Ethical Soundscape, Cassette Sermons and Islamic Counterpublics, explores how a popular Islamic media form, the cassette sermon, has profoundly transformed the political geography of the Middle East over the last 3 decades. His more recent project is a study of the different ways in which Europe's Islamic past inhabits its present, unsettling contemporary efforts to secure Europe's Christian civilizational identity. Taking southern Spain as his focus, he explores the forms of history and memory that mediate and sustain an active relation to Europe's Islamic heritage and the impact these forms have on the ethical and political sense of possibilities of finding a place for Islam in Europe today. Finally, I'd like to thank the multiple sponsors of this event. First and foremost, the Center for the Humanities, which funds the Seeing and Not Seeing Faculty Seminar, and the Center for the Study of Europe. We're also grateful for the sponsorship of the Global Development Policy Center, the School of Theology, CURA, the Department of Anthropology, the Center for Latin American Studies, and Cinema and Media Studies. The breadth of this sponsorship speaks to the goals of the Seeing and Not Seeing Faculty Seminar, and even more so to the richness of Charles Hirschkind's work. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to it.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for that wonderful introduction and for inviting me. That was so long ago now. I ripped the tendons right out of my kneecap right before I was supposed to come last year, so I'm still healing from that. Thanks very much to the faculty seminar on Seeing and Not Seeing for hosting me for these 2 days, and for all of you for coming to this discussion. So the talk I'm going to give here is it's really not about the work I've done more recently in Iberia. And while there is some on Islam, it's not directly about the work I'd done previously in Egypt, though it intersects with both of those in ways. If I cough, don't be afraid. I got that horrible respiratory virus that was going around, but it's over 3 weeks ago, so I'm past it, but I have this residual cough. It may come into play. Hopefully not. Let me get water ready. Okay. I want to thank Elizabeth, if she's still here. She's not still here. Oh, there she is. Yes, for making all the arrangements possible here, and water included, so thank you. Okay. In his recent publication, Redeeming Anthropology, Khaled Fourani offers us a subterranean history of the discipline, focusing on its forgotten and denied involvements with theology. A key aspect of Dr. Fourani's argument concerns the way the anthropological exploration of difference is circumscribed by the culture concept. That is, the only forms of difference the discipline recognizes and authorizes are those legible through the lens of culture and its cognate terms: race, nation, language, society, humanity. In this way, anthropology blinds itself to forms of difference that cannot be accommodated by modern sovereignty, be it that of the state, the individual, the community, etc. Encounters with the transcendent, the divine, the superhuman, or even the radically different are ruled out from the start. This observation has been made by other scholars, of course, including Dipesh Chakrabarty in relation to the discipline of history, and Talal Assad in regard to anthropology. But Dr. Fourani's argument does not stop with this observation, but rather moves in a direction less often charted, an exploration of the complicated relationship anthropology has with theology, a relationship characterized by explicit rejection, but also by extensive, if unacknowledged, influence and appropriation. While some scholars have noted the inescapably theological underpinnings of certain anthropological concepts, Dr. Fourani's book documents the theological orientations that pervade the biographical writings of many practitioners of the discipline, showing us how these orientations underlie the forms of knowledge anthropologists produce. Reading this archive, quote, theologically, he uncovers religious commitments, motivations, desires, in short, forms of life pervasive within the discipline, though rendered illegible by its own fate in a secular epistemology. So this is a good example of a seen and not seen situation. In one section of the book, Dr. Fourani gives close attention to the way leading figures in the discipline have described the epistemological and experiential dimensions of fieldwork, and particularly how the idea of immersion, so frequently referenced by these scholars, is routinely elaborated through a vocabulary grounded in religious concepts of communion. He writes, "When not taken literally, getting lost in the field is best understood as, in a word, immersion, whereby one loses, sheds, dissolves boundaries between oneself as knower and the other that one desires to know. In doing so," he concludes, "anthropologists forsake what Kant demanded they adopt through citizenship in reasondom and for undertaking the task of forging a mature and enlightened, read secular, science, namely autonomy. In short, while anthropologists have consistently invoked Enlightenment aims of objective description, the practice remains indebted to a technique, the loss of the self in the other, founded upon a theological grammar, he argues. I want to follow Furani's provocation, though in a somewhat different direction than he takes in his work. Specifically, I want to think about some of the different ways that anthropological engagements with notions of embodiment and the senses converge with, run parallel to, or draw sustenance from the theological. It is interesting to note in this regard how much of the anthropological scholarship on the body has found a fertile ground for this investigation in the world of religions. This is not to say that anthropologists working in other areas have not made important contributions to the literature on embodiment. They certainly have. But the extent of the contributions made by anthropologists of religion in this area of research is nonetheless striking. What makes religion a natural site for the anthropological investigation of sensory embodied life? I use the term religion here in its most copious sense, recognizing it as an integral element within modern society, but also referring to traditions, practices, and sensibilities that exceed what we refer to as modernity as well. One answer could be, in so much as it is the abstract consciousness of the Cartesian cogito that anchors and inaugurates secular modernity, including the revolution in modern science, then it is understandable that anthropology, with its inherited concern for the non-modern, would turn to religion to explore the limits of that disembodied subject. Here, however, we might want to ask, are our inquiries concerning embodiment only contingently linked to the religious? Or rather, does the primacy of the cogito as the dominant figure and epistemic ground within the secular modern world entail that questions of embodiments will always have, or perhaps more modestly will sometimes have, a more than contingent relation to religion? In other words, given the status of the religious within a modern episteme, do our questions about embodiment necessarily find their most fertile terrain of exploration in the theological and practical resources of religious traditions? And here might we identify, as Khaled Furani has invited us to, important points of convergence between anthropology and theology. These questions are far too large and unwieldy for this talk, or probably for any talk, but I pose them here as a kind of stage setting for a reading of two anthropological texts that follow, one by Talal Assad that directly engages the theological, and a second by the Greek anthropologist Nadia Sarah Matakis that makes no explicit reference to theology and little to religion. Assad and Sarah Matakis are both key and long-standing contributors, in my view, to what has been called an anthropology of the senses. I want to read these two texts not because they are exemplary of this field, but rather for the way they illuminate certain intersections between anthropology and theology and the body. So in Talal Assad's recent paper, Wittgenstein and Religion, he contrasts two dominant approaches to the Quran within the Islamic tradition. For the so-called rationalists, a viewpoint often exemplified by the Mu'tazilites, the meaning of the Quran is to be disclosed through the exercise of abstract reason, al-aql, such that apparent contradictions within the text can be theoretically resolved. In contrast, for the traditionalists, as they have come to be labeled by scholars of Islam, the language of Scripture is perfect as it stands, as the Quran itself declares, and requires not speculative interpretation, but rather an attitude of trust and a capacity of willing obedience. These qualities of character are cultivated within the context of an Islamic community, including through practices of memorizing and reciting the Quran, and through the forms of reflexivity that are integral to the learning of these practices. Every scholar of the history of Islam learns about these two contrasting approaches to the divine word and their respective fortunes within Muslim scholarly opinion across the centuries, though the lesson has often been told more as a lament that Muslims miss the chance at enlightenment when they fail to fully embrace a rationalist hermeneutics. This debate among Muslim scholars concerning approaches to the Quran could be taken to illustrate one aspect of discursive traditions that Assad has foregrounded in many of his writings, namely a tradition's ability to encompass, indeed its reliance upon, argument and disagreement. However, this is not at all the point Assad is interested in making in this essay on Wittgenstein and religion. The essay, rather, seeks to elaborate a certain perspective on religion and religious language through a reading of Wittgenstein. In this context, Assad's recourse to this debate among Muslim thinkers is meant to foreground certain aspects of a Wittgensteinian perspective on language. The standpoint of the traditionalists, Ibn Taymiyyah is mentioned, and particularly their critique of their rationalist opponents, finds important parallels, Assad suggests, in Wittgenstein's own sensibility to language and his critical reading of conventional philosophy. This is an interesting moment within the trajectory of Assad's writings. It is one of the very few instances in which he takes up a position within a debate internal to Islam, in this case, in order to clarify an analytical perspective on religion, one that he has been developing over many years. For the article articulates what could be called a moral preference for a traditionalist position, and a concomitant wariness toward the intellectualism of the rationalists and their problem-solving attitude to perceived contradictions in the Quran. This uncharacteristic move in Assad's essay, I want to suggest, illuminates a dimension of his thinking, a certain epistemic stance, that I want to think more about here. For while Assad's work has long entailed thinking with and through religious traditions, here in this essay on Wittgenstein, we have an occasion to explore Assad's own analytical perspective through the theologically grounded arguments of the traditionalists, and particularly their understanding of the limits of human knowledge and reasoning, and of the dangers entailed when those limits are forgotten or ignored. One way to think about Assad's invocation of this debate between the rationalist and the traditionalist is to place it in relation to a long-standing critique in his work of an intellectualist bias within secular modes of knowledge, and a corresponding inattention to the embodied practices that constitute a form of life. Stated in these terms, however, this distinction needs some qualification. What distinguishes the sort of philosophical knowledge, one characteristic of secular modernity, but also of the 10th century Mu'tazila, that Assad is concerned with here? One key term we might start with is abstraction. For returning to the debate among Muslim scholars, Assad writes, "Traditionalists do not reject reasoning. What they reject is the notion that the Quran must be an object of an abstract faculty called reason in order to make sense." To further clarify what is meant by abstract faculty of reason in this claim, he turns to an observation by the Hanbalite jurist and theologian Ibn Taymiyyah on the superfluity of definitions for both theoretical and practical knowledge. Glossing Ibn Taymiyyah's viewpoint, Assad observes, learning to practice a particular form of life is prior to the offering of definitions or redefinitions. One can understand and enact what is required in one's form of life perfectly well without resorting to definitions. End of quote. Like the hermeneutics advocated by the rationalists, the practice of, quote, offering definitions, referred to here, suggests a scene in which the ordinary use of a word is found lacking, a lack that is to be overcome by standing back and outside from the context of practical use, where the word is at home, and providing a metalinguistic gloss, a translation meant to supplement its perceived inadequacy. Philosophical investigations has attuned us with humorous effect to such moments of language on holiday, as Wittgenstein describes them. While this example of definition giving takes us some way toward understanding the kind of abstract reason that Assad is concerned with, it is also useful to think about the limits of this example. Imagine, for the sake of argument, an institution centered on the practice of producing definitions, say a guild of dictionary writers, whose dictionaries are used across a range of pedagogical sites as part of a traditional curriculum. The production and use of these dictionaries, in other words, is integral to context of learning, whereby traditional forms of knowledge are sustained and produced. My point in offering this oversimplified scene of the dictionary is to suggest that it is not the resort to definitions per se that entails a break from the ordinary, but the way such practices relates to, coheres with, the form of life to which the practice contributes. Which brings me back to Assad's argument with the rationalists. What is the quality of the abstraction performed by the rationalists that not only makes it incompatible with, quote, a practical response to the Quran as heard, as Assad puts it, but that threatens its authority as revelation, as Assad puts it? Put in different terms, when does an intellectual practice stop being practical and become abstract? Let me approach this question from within the traditionalist perspective Assad explores in the essay. Traditionalists encounter the Quran as God's speech, addressing them, Assad writes, in ways that are impossible to grasp fully in human language, but that humans can, nonetheless, respond to. The Quran, on this view, entails not an interpretive act aimed at securing its rational coherence, but, quote, a practical engagement with an essentially indescribable force, an engagement grounded in a deep awareness of human limitation and dependence, or an attunement to the, quote, independent character of the force power that grasps human life from outside. This engagement requires, what he says, trust as a predisposition toward the divine, as well as the virtue of dread, awe, reverence. Judged from a traditionalist standpoint, the arguments of the rationalists betray a profound hubris, a Promethean ambition to resolve what they identify as problems in the Quran, ascribing to themselves knowledge and power beyond what they possess. Instead of responding to the divine word from within the resources of the tradition they have inherited, including a deep respect for human limitation, they proceed from an overestimation of human agency, a viewpoint from which every friction on human design or knowledge appears as a problem requiring a solution. It is in regard to this problem-solving stance and the desire for control that drives it forward that the Muslim rationalists of the 10th century align with the secular modernity of today. Assad writes, "The greatest failure of modernity, one that Wittgenstein sensed, has been the continuous desire to move the world toward an increasingly controlled future. Such a failure issues from the belief that every problem we meet must have a solution. Feeding the hubris of the age, modern techniques, he notes, tend to promote a distinctive mindset, one in which what exists must be quantifiable, representable, exchangeable, so manipulable. Gradually, that precondition for identifying existence becomes a primary criterion of truth and reason." Notably, the sensibility for human finitude and for the danger of neglecting this fact appears across Assad's writings. Recall, for example, the essay on agency and pain in Formations of the Secular. That essay explores some of the ways different societies have responded to human vulnerability, to pain and suffering, not as something to be overcome, but as an element of embodied existence that must be encountered and lived via the resources of a specific tradition, just as the words of God, according to the traditionalist position described above by Assad, are not to be overcome, resolved through speculative engagement, but responded to via the practical and discursive resources of the Islamic tradition. In his discussion of Christian martyrs, or of the movement among some women to live through pregnancy and birth without recourse to pain medication, it is not simply the fact of human embodiment that is being highlighted, but the way a recognition of that fact gives shape to distinct ways of responding to pain, and thus distinct forms of life. If we wanted to give a theological name for this act of recognition, we might call it surrender. In an insightful essay written almost 20 years ago now, David Scott explored this anti-Promethean element within Assad's writings in terms of a tragic sensibility, a cultivated appreciation for the exposure of human life to historical processes, events, and forces beyond human comprehension or mastery. You know, Wittgenstein, I'll just mention as a side, has this very famous statement where he says, even though I'm not a religious person, I tend to see everything through a religious perspective. And I sort of think what he's getting at is a vision like this, one in which is attuned to, let's say, an appreciation for the exposure of human life to processes, events, forces beyond human mastery. But I can talk about that idea more later. In Scott's words, Assad is a thinker responsive to the tragic in human life, to the antagonism between our determined will and the varied contingencies that often thwart and sometimes reverse it, our propensity to the sorts of moral conflict that lead toward disappointment, suffering, and even catastrophe. The rueful gray colors his mind's activity, says David Scott. Assad's thinking, he continues, Assad's thinking about history and human action as our mode of being in history is alert to the frailties and opacities that make us less than the self-sufficient reasoners we suppose ourselves to be, and that expose us to aspects of ourselves and our worlds over which we have little or no rational control. Tragedy, Scott suggests, cautions us against attaching ourselves too strongly to the promises of problem-solving reason, a caution that reappears in different guises across Assad's work, including in the recent essay on Wittgenstein, as I have highlighted here. To a certain extent, the tragic sensibility elaborated by Scott finds resonance in the traditionalist perspective, as Assad outlines it in this essay, particularly its recognition of the limits of human understanding. But Assad's discussion of the traditionalist approach to the Quran also points us in another direction, one that sits awkwardly with the tragic sensibility highlighted by Scott. While the practical response to the Quran enacted by the traditionalist is one, as Assad tells us, built on trust as a predisposition toward the divine, this attitude also extends to the community of Muslims, insomuch as the latter embodies and transmits the divinely guided tradition that Muslims aspire to sustain. As Assad notes, in emphasizing the implications of this attitude of trust by reference to the Shahada, the testimony of faith, he writes, the testimony of faith, the Shahada, is not, in other words, simply an affirmation of conviction, although it is that too, but a declaration made to the community of absolute faith and trust in God, and consequently of a commitment to follow a particular form of life. End quote. In other words, the practical response of the traditionalist to the Quran entails an act of submission, both to the divine words as they are heard, and to the Islamic form of life wherein that hearing occurs, and thus to the social relationships and qualities of character that enable and sustain it. As Assad notes, for the traditionalists, the epithets are not representations. The different divine names of God are not representations, but an essential means of relating to divinity. Not only do the human passions of security, loyalty, integrity, faithfulness give the human relations of friendship and love their everyday strength, they also provide means of grasping and building on relations with the divine through the formation of virtuous character. What stands out in Assad's engagement with this scholarly debate, I want to suggest, is less a sensibility for the tragic character of life, for the limits of our will before a world that resists our mastery, than a feeling for human dependence and interdependence, in enacting their faith in the divine words, not through intellectual speculation, but through the embodied practices of recitation and memorization. Muslims cultivate the virtues and attributes of character that sustain healthy human relationships: modesty, humility, kindness, forgiveness, patience. These virtues are both duties incumbent on one as a Muslim and qualities that make bearable the bodily condition of human dependence and vulnerability, including misfortune, pain, aging, and death. While these virtues are not solely the provenance of religious traditions, they find their greatest emphasis and elaboration within many religious traditions. Many of them have faded into relative decline and obsolescence in modern society, a point Assad notes in his conclusion in relation to compassion and reverence. He writes, "Less attended to is compassion, as at once feeling and action for the pain and suffering living beings, even though the suffering is clearly an unavoidable consequence of our progress-driven world. This may be why reverence, the deep awareness of human limitation and dependence, is no longer recognized as a virtue." Returning to the essay on agency and pain mentioned above, it is notable that the primary examples of tradition shaped through a recognition of human vulnerability to pain all concern embodied relational virtues. The embrace of suffering by the early Christians, Assad argues in his comments on the historian Judith Perkins' work, opened up a new economy of action that required that one's own pain and the pain of others be engaged with differently. In referring to Pamela Clausen's work on birthing practices among religious women in North America, he writes, "For the act of birthing doesn't merely produce another living body, it also creates a vital relationship which is imbued with sensitivity to pain, the relationship that binds mother and child actively together. The mother is an agent as a consequence of what she has done in a particular social situation, after the event as it were, and not because of her conscious intention. End of quote. In both of these readings, the agency cultivated through an engagement with the irreducible alterity of pain finds its home in a world of human interdependency. In the reading of the Oedipus myth, Assad offers toward the end of the essay, it is the passions that articulate Oedipus's relationship to his immediate family that compel him to act as he does. Oedipus puts out his own eyes, Assad observes, not because his conscience or his God considers that he deserves to be punished for failing to be responsible, or because he thinks he does, but because, as he says, he cannot bear the thought of having to look his father and mother in the eyes when he joins them beyond the grave, or to see his children begotten as they were begotten. If we return now to the critique of the rationalist position Assad elaborates across his engagement with Wittgenstein, we might be in a better position to specify the kind of problem abstract reason represents. In light of the points addressed here, we might say that the notion of abstraction, more than simply a kind of intellectualism, refers to a distance from a context of embodied social relationship, or more specifically, from a form of life grounded in a recognition of human dependency and predicated on the practice of those virtues that correspond to this condition. There is a distinct echo here of Marx's analysis of the abstraction enacted by the commodity form and its corrosive impact on the embodied skills and dispositions that, in feudal society, had constituted the social identities of table maker and cobbler. For Assad, more attuned to the frailty and fragility of the human condition, it is the religious virtues of dependent being that respond more directly to our tenuous predicament. So now I'll shift to this other text I want to take up. In her lyrical text, The Senses Still, from 1994, Nadia Sarah Matakis traces the modern career of the senses through a dense ethnographic exploration of the transformation of social and economic life at a site on the European periphery in rural Greece. Following the arc of her own experience from earliest childhood memories up to the present, she offers a powerful account of modernity as sensory loss, as a withering away of the density and depth of the senses as they come to be increasingly functionalized and rationalized within a capitalist culture, transformed into the privatized sense organs required of the modern consumer. In this, her account follows and extends Walter Benjamin's writings on the modern decline of experience, as found in The Storyteller and many other essays, paralleling Benjamin's accounts of the rise of information, a modality of knowledge characterized by its immediate applicability and rapid obsolescence, barely touching the sensorial experience of its consumer. Sarah Matakis writes, each episode of consumption is relatively absolute and quickly totalizing because it never lingers long enough in the senses as social memory to be stitched into a social fabric with the others it has displaced. She has a lot on the sort of slowness of the senses, on the kind of time required, and it's an interesting parallel to sort of some of Assad's writings on temporality. Like he has an essay on the sort of 2011 uprisings in Egypt, where he wants to think about the failure of the uprising in ways, and wants to think about, in part, about that the time required, for to cultivate the possibility of a certain kind of response, including to overcome divisions across people, across some of the divisions that were present in Tahrir Square. Right, that sort of the cultivation of those embodied skills requires a certain kind of what she would call a stillness, a time, a space in which to do so, which is incompatible, let's say, with the accelerations of modernity. Is one of the arguments he makes there. But she has a lot of emphasis on the sort of what she calls a kind of necessary stillness that is integral to the forms of memory she's talking about here. Objects that once unlocked and mediated the past now become covered in a dust, namely the perceptual waste material formed by the historical cultural repression of sensory experience and memory, a condition that sunders the once valued artifacts from their lived relation to the present. The senses for Sarah Matakis are not faculties of the individual, but work in the interstices between people and between people and things. She gives particular attention to the way material culture is endowed with emotional and historical sedimentation, with sensory memory and multiplicity, one that defies capture or totalization within the circuits of established meaning that predominate in capitalist culture. These layers of memory, beyond consciousness and intention, are released through acts of perceptual completion, performances that enact a mutation of meaning and memory that refracts the mutual insertion of the perceiver and perceived in historical experience, and possibly their mutual alienation from public culture, official memory, and formal economies. Importantly, these performative acts, she argues, entail not the enactment of a code or convention, but are moments of poiesis, the emergence of something novel. Let me pause for a moment in order to highlight some points of overlap between Sarah Matakis' account of the senses and Assad's reflections on religious language. Like the traditionalist theology discussed by Assad, Sarah Matakis' concept of sensory memory similarly articulates a world that exceeds human comprehension and mastery, a world that human interactions must inhabit as a guest, not a master. Human intentions must inhabit as a guest, not a master. The generative and creative force that defines the limits and possibilities of human life, beyond or outside of conscious orchestration, is not transcendent to this world in Sarah Matakis' vision, but immanent to it, and encompassing humans as well as the artifactual landscape they inhabit. Consciousness, from this perspective she provides, does not find its career in abstract reason. Rather, it saturates the world as imaginal memory, striating the objects and substances that materially mediate it. In this sense, it is not the product of the society, as a long tradition within anthropology would have it, but of a poiesis generated by both human and non-human elements, by both social and natural processes. Sarah Matakis' most evocative description of the layering of memory in the senses occurs in the section of the book where she recounts her childhood memories of rural life, and particularly her relation to her grandmother. That relation is based in what she calls commensality, a term used to indicate not simply the exchange of food and drink, but the exchange of sensory memories and emotions, and of substances and objects, incarnating remembrance and feeling. Commensality describes the process by which a baby is born into social being, molded into historical consciousness through the exchanges of food, saliva, words, and body parts that take place between child and grandmother. Through acts of feeding the baby's food, chewed and softened in the grandmother's own mouth, calling out the names of her body parts, all the while touching and talking to the baby, the grandmother transfers substances and words, her own, but also those of the generations past, into the baby, infusing the child with sensory memory of the family and community, or in their vernacular, baking the child. As Sarah Matakis writes, the grandma's molding of breadcrumbs with saliva is a transcription of the self onto matter, which is then transferred into the body of the child. This is the materialization of the person and the personification of matter. The transcription of self onto substance and then into the child's body is inseparable from the transmission of emotions as a fuel of this exchange, which is why this is understood as one heart for two bodies. In these beautiful passages, we see the social materialization of the child through the complete collapse of any boundary between self and other, the experience of the one dissolving into the experience of the other. This process can best be described as one of ensoulment, what Assad will define as the living ability to act intentionally in the indefinite web of life, to have a world, a language, together with others, we, you, she, he, they, who are themselves persons in processes of being made and remade. Ensoulment indicates a formative process that endows the child with capacities of practical reason, including the ability to inhabit, via memory and feeling, the temporalities that underlay the collective life of the rural community. Sensory memory, stored in substances and people, also bind the living to the dead. Sarah Matakis writes, grandma feeding the child is also resurrecting it from death as a kind of generational sleep. She feeds the child that is often named after herself, her husband, or one of the dead children. Food is not only cooked by saliva, but by emotions and memory. The dead can be raised through cooking, eating, awakening, and exchanging, which all require memory. End of quote. The dead are not confined within psychological memory as simply persons to be mourned, but materially instantiated, resurrected in the present, including in the body of the child, nor can the active engagement of the living with the dead, as Sarah Matakis figures it, be translated in the register of the symbolic. I was just reading a book a few weeks ago by, I think her name is Vincent Després. Does anyone know her? Anyway, she has a book about life after death. And she makes the argument that, in life we don't exist autonomously. We exist in part as the way we are responded to, held in memory, held, entwined with other lives. And so that doesn't end immediately after death, because we continue after death to have a kind of reverberation in the way that those processes continue of. And so she wants to think about life and death in a more literal sense in that way, as there's a certain way in which we're wrong to think like that, when we emphasize that, one only exists in memory after death, to think we're that much more during life. I mean, she wants to emphasize during life we are also the very social reverberations of our lives, which is somewhat parallel to what Sarah Matakis is arguing. In a latter paragraph, Sarah Matakis describes Greek exhumation practices during which women retrieve the bones of their deceased and proceed to dust them off, wash them and dry them in the sun. In removing the dust, the bones' own senses, as she puts it, are unblocked and thus become reconnected to the mourner's memory. As she notes, the dust on the bones and their cleaning encapsulates a material allegory of the temporal chasm that separates the living from the dead. This is the distance that is crossed by exhumation, an act of ritual purification that is understood as a sensory restoration and awakening of both the mourner and the bones which places them in communication. While the language adopted by Sarah Matakis, here and in the sections I have cited above, is not explicitly theological, it frequently veers onto a common conceptual terrain. Sensory memory, as she develops the term, opens up perspectives that resist formulation within secular epistemologies. In this latter case, the presence of the dead among the living. Once the materialist assumptions of the Enlightenment undermine the possibilities of the soul, the idea of the afterlife and of the ongoing existence of the dead in the lives of those still living became difficult to affirm, except in the narrow and increasingly psychologized space defined by the concept of mourning. Right, that the dead became only difficult to affirm acceptance through the lens of mourning. And according to the new DSM manual, after 6 months it becomes pathological. So, despite the not uncommon experience of finding that one is deceased or not fully gone, Sarah Matakis' way of conjoining memory and materiality offers a rich language for conceiving of the ongoing animacy of the dead. The senses dethrone the sovereign subject of secular liberalism, not simply by downgrading consciousness and intentionality, but rather by reconceiving of them in terms of a sensorially dense imaginal memory. Consciousness here, we could say, doesn't find its apotheosis in abstract reason of the individual. It appears instead as a historical unconscious, entwined with the substrate of objects and substances that both sustain and release it through acts of perceptual completion. Through acts of commensality, the subject of the senses inherits, is born into a form of life, including its forms of reflection and feeling, through material practices of incorporation, transfer, exchange, imprint, a kind of amoebic absorption mediated by social relationships, as with grandmother and grandchild. If we were to describe this in the language of certain mystical traditions, we could say the process involves the dissolution of self into other. Moreover, an obvious anthropological precursor for Sarah Matakis' analytical language would certainly be the work of the French missionary Maurice Lienhart, whose descriptions of the, quote, cosmomorphic world of the Kanak of New Caledonia bore the imprint of his own spiritual confrontation with questions of divine immanence, as James Clifford has described. Commensality also bears on the practice of anthropology. How can inquiry into the commensal practices of other cultures be undertaken, Sarah Matakis asks, when researchers do not consider or generate accounts of the historical formation, repression of commensal ethics and sensory reciprocities within their own culture and particular discipline? The perceptual grids installed by the commensal structure of modernity direct the anthropologist's attention to the surface residue, the dust that covers and obscures the ongoing presence of alternative histories, materialities, memories, those not perceivable via the realist conventions of our dominant epistemologies. To enter the commensal depths of other societies, to inhabit the memory of other senses and material reciprocities, Sarah Matakis argues, requires long-term fieldwork and sensory archaeology. Khaled Fourani encourages us to think of the sort of ethnographic immersion described here by Sarah Matakis as analogous to the theistic practice of communion, paradigmatically captured in the example of the Eucharist, whereby a consonant logic infuses both fieldwork and this type of sacral sight, a vision of uniting the seeker with the sought after. The practices of both anthropology and the Eucharist are predicated on a different relation to truth than that sanctioned by Enlightenment reason. In both practices, he writes, the truth of the other presupposes a relational subject, also qualified as heteronymous or porous, demanding immersion in truth and participation with it, as distinct from attaining truth through means founded on models of correspondence or representation. For both Assad and Sarah Matakis, this immersive practice, one Fourani invites us to consider as mystical, entails a return to the intimacy, affectivity, and vulnerability of social relationships. For both authors, there is an ethical concern for the abstracting force of modernity on our shared forms of life, a distance between us, produced by the rationalization and functionalization of the senses, and the dust this leaves on our eyes and material culture, or by the authority given to scientism and abstract reason within modern society. To conclude, let me note that the two anthropologists I have chosen to focus on in this paper are in no way exemplary of the field, and any generalizing claims I may have made about the scholarship on embodiment within the discipline, I said are clearly unfounded. I wouldn't say unfounded, but I would say partial. However, with these qualifications in place, let me summarize my attempt here as follows. I have asked, what is the problem space within which embodiment emerges as an area of inquiry in recent anthropological work, for some at least, and might this space be conceived as having resulted from the secular evacuation of theological reason? Thank you. That's it. So, question?
You want to take your own question?
Sure. Give me time to drink, though, please. Or comments, or nervousness, or...
I'll start by asking if you could say a bit about how the concerns you've expressed, you've discussed today, either sit next to or came out of or speak back to the work you did in your two books.
I think it does speak to both of them in somewhat different ways. And right, in the first book, I was talking about a mode of attunement by which people sought to sort of attune themselves to the divine word, which required sort of acquiring certain sort of sensibilities and embodied capacities. And I see that as, right, I mean, how does one come to draw closer to God, right? How does one overcome the barriers, which are never fully overcomable, right, between the divine and human? And what sort of practices through which one achieves that, right? And it is a practice very much involving the body. And as I talk about in that book, in the Quran, it's elaborated in terms of a certain sort of responsiveness of the soul, but of different aspects of the flesh, right, of the body and its, in all sorts of dimensions. and in some way, like Sarah Matakis, and is talking in some ways, right, about a kind of social material merging, right, that occurs through these transfers between grandmother and as a kind of embodied practice. And I'm speaking about a sort of relation with the divine that is cultivated similarly through a kind of, in ways, learned within the tradition. The traditionalist perspective that Assad is talking about means, right, that is, instead of subjecting the words of the Quran to critical scrutiny and seeking to find to establish the sort of reason underlying them, one cultivates a form of submission to them, right? Recognizing the limitations of one's ability to even to engage, but certainly to know what they are. And that one learns that through a practice handed down that's one learns from childhood around memorizing and learning to recite, and later on certain kind of imaginal exercises that one does in the course of reciting. But those are, right, they're deeply embodied practices in ways. And the other parallel is, in my first book that was very much, it thought of the way in which that sensitivity to the Quran was part and parcel of learning certain kinds of virtues, right? And I talked about, and those primarily were some of the ones I mentioned here, about fear of God is one, but it connected very closely with humility, modesty, kindness, reverence. And those are all, in some sense, those are very much foregrounded in these two texts here, and they all sit uncomfortably a little bit in a modern sort of world. And I think, so in some ways, like, I could have spoken about those more than embodiment in some way, because it seems to me that in both cases there's a kind of a deep excavation of the conditions of social relationship for both these writers, and a kind of mourning of the loss of the way how sort of modern forms of knowledge, and this was Wittgenstein's concern as well, particularly the imposition of kind of scientific reason as somehow relevant to all dimensions of our lives, right? Alienated us or distanced us from our conditions as embodying beings necessarily dependent on each other, on our material landscape, on the divine. That relationship of dependency is, so that runs through these thinkers in a way. In my later book, right, I'm also thinking about a kind of counter history in Spain, right, and the way in which a history that's sort of rendered difficult to encounter within a sort of modern epistemic and perceptual regime, but which there is a certain tradition of cultivating the ability to connect with through art, through music, through cultivating those feelings that allow that give that history life in the present, and so on. So it's and so this sort of like the idea of kind of attunement and cultivation and runs across these, it seems to it, ways. And in the Spanish case, right, the primary concern of this tradition I look at is that Spain is out of kilter with itself in a way that's dangerous for it, right? That comes at a price. And that price for many of them has to do with the sort of loss and the breakdown of certain traditions. Hence, it's a kind of, it's seen as a kind of romanticism, but because certain valued forms of life are lost when one loses touch with, they want to argue, with that kind of history that's effaced by a modernist regime. So I do think there are commonalities across those. Thanks for that. Please.
Hi, Nula Lori. I'm an assistant professor at the Pardee School of Global Studies. Nice to meet you. So I'm coming into this as a political scientist that's totally outside of this field, and so maybe it's kind of more of a comment and maybe a dumb connection that you can push against it. I guess one of the things that emerged in this conversation around embodiment is whether Islam lends itself to that kind of an approach more than other religions, or whether that doesn't matter at all. And I'm thinking, the physicality of prayer, and not just once a day, but 5 times a day, and the physicality of like the fasting, and I know that there are some of those other kinds of traditions, and I think this is coming out of, as a political scientist teaching Intro to Middle East politics, and just having to constantly grapple with this notion of like regime type and religion, and Islam, is it authoritarian in nature, and blah blah blah, and then you'll have responses like Esposito and others who then spend a lot of time just trying to convince other people that, hey, actually Islam and democracy are compatible. And so I try to kind of evade that whole debate by making political Islam about politics as opposed to religion. But I also sometimes wonder whether that's because I'm trying to get away from these kind of Orientalist static notions of religion that find themselves articulated in contemporary political science, or maybe there is something there that it is about Islam that, I don't know if there's something about this religion.
Are you suggesting that others have the idea that if Islam is more embodied or something, that would itself lend itself to a more authoritarian political form? Is that the argument? Or?
No, I'm saying I think of these things in terms of like how specific is this religion to others because of the biases that are built into Middle East politics and the way it's kind of taught and has been taught to me. But I'm asking if, like, for your exploration in this piece, it's kind of centered around the Quran and Islam. Is that? Yeah.
In the 19th century, when Europeans, colonists went there, the first thing they noted, not just in Islam, but in Africa and many places, was that life seemed to be too embodied, right? And so they highlighted what they saw as the overemphasis on the kind of bodily dimensions in context of pedagogy, in context of knowledge more generally, and they saw as a sort of failure to attain the purity of reason and so on. And some, and eventually, some people in the Middle East came to have similar views, and there have been many reforms in that direction. And so that fit with a certain kind of, we could say, a bias that we recognize was part of, I guess Said talks about this in terms of Orientalism or something, but in terms of models and about education and what was appropriate to context of education, then there was too much movement, too much sound. I was just talking to someone the other day. We were, because one of the things that struck Europeans that, like, when you teach the Quran, you often have lots of people reciting, simultaneously, but not at the same, reciting in the same room, but you have a kind of cacophony of voices. I know, I was in the music department at Ithaca College yesterday, and somebody's doing a dissertation on practice rooms, and they were saying, well, how could you have practice if you didn't have practice rooms? Because you'd have the bombarding sounds, right, of all around. But that's kind of a modern problem that emerges only, It wasn't a problem to have a multiplicity of sounds. One focused on the sound one was making without sort of necessarily it was distracting that many other people might be making other kinds of sounds. So it wasn't seen as such a huge problem, which is interesting. In terms of overall the question you're asking, I don't think it's like specific to Islam in that sense. One finds like, I think at least the kind of points I'm making, I see sort of, I think of them in relation to many traditions. And there's scholars in many different traditions who sort of explored, let's say, what I've called embodied dimensions of those traditions, whether Buddhism and including Buddhism, where there's a sort of long-standing sense that Buddhism is the least embodied on the other. On the other hand, there's plenty of, that was kind of a mistake, and there's plenty of embodiment in Buddhism. And even things that appear not very embodied are themselves like, even the sort of the performance of a kind of, rational stillness of the academic lecture, let's say, is a certain embodied form, and it requires, training and so So I don't think you could make a. I mean, I appreciate the question. It is interesting to me, the idea, because like one thinks about. I mean, I guess both the writers I'm talking about would say, right, that there is a way in which certain kind of modern forms of practice, their kind of critique of them has to do with a certain sort of inadequate recognition of the embodied dimensions of life, right? Particularly, and the way that the relationships of interdependency and vulnerability that are consonant with that, that are part of that. So there is a sense of a kind of the thinning of embodied life, if you wanted to think of it that way, emerges in tandem with the kinds of, call it alienated form of life, or call it a form of life alienated from that kind of enmeshment in social relations that for Wittgenstein, who inspired Assad here, right, he saw that the kind of insistence on the adequacy of a single form of reason, scientific reason, as if it could be applied to all aspects of our lives, tended to kind of render ethical life, impossible in ways, turning everything into a matter of sort of scientific reason. And in terms of political Islam, that point is, I mean, I think you're right the way you're thinking about it, and it's to think about new forms of political forms that emerge, and I don't think you want to sort of think that there's something, there's something called Islam and something called politics, that one is seeing, the notion of speaking of like the concept of religion as we inherit it is always entwined with the politics in a way. It has some existence independent of it. It emerges as a modern political category in some ways. And so there's not some sort of normative distinction that one wants to use, but one wants to look at different configurations one can think of Islam and politics, and including. So I wouldn't, in principle, say, when Islam weighs into the political arena, then it's not Islam. That would not be right either, right? Because who set the boundary on what is relevant to Islam or not? That's always changing, right? And that's being argued over by Muslims, saying, no, you shouldn't go there. That you shouldn't be speaking about politics. And others saying, no, actually, that's relevant to how we live as Muslims. And
yeah. Let me ask an extension of that.
Yeah.
Just riffing on your last comment of who set the boundaries on what is Islam.
Yeah.
Maybe asking who set the boundaries on what is religion.
Yeah.
In that sense, which is, so maybe it's a two-pronged question that
Speak a little louder.
Sorry. I usually speak so loud, Jeff. So it's the question that I'm bringing up maybe in two ways might crash into each other a little bit nonsensical, but I'll give it a shot. I'm thinking about Nora's question about this and wondering specifically in terms of locating the theological or the religious hidden underpinnings of what was supposed to be an Enlightenment and anthropological project in the dissolution of the self into the other, and wondering why that's necessarily just a religious kind of concept. And it might come from other kinds of philosophical traditions as well, or even concepts of personhood that we might see coming out of sort of late 1800s, like Zimmel and others. So I wonder why you're locating that specifically as a religious disposition. But then let's say you do, and go with that for a moment. Then what are the stakes of owning it, right? And of saying, fine. Of course that's been there from the beginning, and not just in the ways that you guys, I mean, it was there even in some forms of Boasian anthropology, right? If we look at Hirschkind or others who were absolutely questioning the premise of a notion of self and othering and undoing that,
yes.
Right? So if it was there from at least hinted, even if we didn't go that way as a dominant form, it was there in the beginnings of certain forms of anthropology, which is part of what you're saying.
Yes.
Assad located it in particular ways, but perhaps the obnoxious question is, so what? And where does that place us in terms of thinking through the implications for that as why even hold it up as a secular versus religious thing?
yes. No, I love that question. You're right. Khaled Fourani, like his book is about precisely what you're saying. Like we find it in Boaz, we find it throughout the history of anthropology, and he looks both at the various ways in which theologically tinged concepts enter into the description of the anthropologists from the late 19th century, from the early formation of the discipline and so on. So on one hand, he wants to say, it's always been there. On the other hand, he wants to say, and there has always been a certain kind of insistence within the discipline on its distinction from religion, right? On this is not a kind of religion, it aspires to a kind of objective thinking, or it aspires to a kind of, well, for much of it, it aspires to a kind of science, right? And you could trace that across much of the 20th century, even if today we say, well, we certainly don't aspire to science. But for much of the discipline, there was the forefield is, has all kinds of scientific ambitions built into it. His argument is that if there was more sort of explicit engagement, explicit sort of opening to the theological, not just as sort of an unconscious underpinning of the discipline, but a kind of embrace of it, that it would open up, possibilities of thinking about difference more. It would open up a kind of more useful vocabulary to the discipline, he might say, right? That there are kind of constraints on the ability to think otherness, particularly tied to the culture concept of which is, a concept that emerges with the nation state and confines our thinking to that. And one could say that, one thinks about the ontological turn in anthropology and so on, and that how few engagements with theology there are in that, even though theology has always been involved in this. But there's a kind of caution about that. Like, there's a lot of interest in South American kind of forms of connecting to nature. There's not a lot of interest in Christian connection to the divine as somehow something rather also to teach us as part of what might be an ontological turn, right? And so I'm just saying, so there's a nervousness there around theology that he would probably say we'd do better to move beyond and more fully embrace. Why are these distinctly religious disciplines? I don't think they're distinctly only religious disciplines. It seems though like a lot of that religion is certainly one, whatever we mean by religion, it seems to be one place where one finds a lot of the kind of resources to think about. And we find, traditions of thinking about interdependency, about sort of human finitude. There are other non-religious traditions for certain. And so it's not to say that it's, exhaustively within this. But
Sure.
About that, because
Yeah.
I was sort of meditating on a similar question, which is,
Can everyone hear?
which is sort of based
Yeah.
on the structure of your argument, which is that what space is left from the evacuation of the theological that embodiment ultimately ends up filling, and then is there a hermeneutic utility in thinking of finitude, lack of mastery, recognition of frailty, fragility, and interdependence as religious, which is a different way of asking the same. And what is the hermeneutic utility of thinking about it as religion? I have a totally self-interested reason for asking this too, but because I'm struggling with how to think about what the...
you're turning on the head sort of what I said, right? Because I'm saying it's useful, those things are useful to think about the world with. And you're saying, is there something useful in thinking about them as distinctly religious?
Right, and the other question is, did you use one text that is explicitly about theology and one that is totally not, to do two versions of this, one that is religious and one that is not, or were you actually saying that these two texts attend to the same things in different languages, and there's a way of thinking about Matakis as theological?
Sort of the latter, right? Because they are two different, yes. And so, in some sense, I guess I'm thinking that theology or different whatever in a very broad sense of that, right? Sometimes maybe I should just say religion here, provides, and leaving that very open, but provides sort of kinds of conceptual resources that that one sees elaborated in these two texts in ways. And even though Sarah Matakis is not explicitly making reference to theological texts, her language, it seems to me, is very much, it's one that's very close to a lot of theological languages. I was just reading, I just was giving comments on a book by Lata Mani. I don't know if you know Lata Mani. So Lata had, due to an accident many years ago, Lata became sort of a mystical poet, but after being an anthropologist at first, and then she returned to sort of more social scientific writing, but she's really a sort of mystic now. And she writes about, so she says what she calls a tantric vision, and she draws on a certain kind of Indian tradition, but with a strong emphasis on relationality and the unity of existence, let's say. A certain theological, an image that I want to say is theological, or at least it's not only theological, but it's certainly one that has been most fully elaborated, and we tend to associate it with theology there. So I guess I'm being somewhat pragmatic in that, right? I'm thinking, well, where does one find these, and it was interesting. I was on a panel about to talk about her book, and there were all sorts of people I never would have associated. Donna Haraway was talking about it and used it to talk about her own thinking about, interspecies relationship. And Lata does this in a mystical language more, but they're talking about things Donna understood herself to be talking about something very similar and drew on Lata's language to sort of flesh out things that she had elaborated in other languages. So in that sense, it seems to me that Lata's text highlighted the extent to which yes, I guess on one hand I want to say it illuminated the way that the theology is already present, what I'm calling theology in the way. And in making us more aware of that, perhaps it maybe changes the way we think about the relation across these divides that we are sometimes bump up against between religion and secular, or between, theology and science. Please.
Yeah, hi. So, first of all, thank you for this. Oh yeah, Michael Zank, Department of Religion. Thank you for this.
Kimberly York and Joanna Davis.
Sorry. Kimberly.
But now you distracted me.
I'm sorry.
Just to listen to the conversation between political science and anthropology, and bringing myself in from the religion department and as a former theologian, I think you're absolutely right in utilizing theological, what I would call categories, to describe something that escapes us if we only use abstract modes of analysis. So I think that's absolutely correct. I think the discomfort with that method arises because we intuit that theology as such has something normative that comes with it, whether we like it or not. So we are then torn between the descriptive or hermeneutic practice that you're presenting to us in this beautiful way, and theological frameworks from within which this descriptive practice is not really what is of interest or of primary relevance. So that's why we come to political science and the question of whether theology ultimately, if we are selling ourselves to theology, are we not buying the normativity that comes with it?
Yeah. I mean, that way to put it suggests that normativity is only on one side of that, right? Because we could also worry that normativity is on the other side too, right? The anthropological side.
That's what you...
Yes. So in some sense, like, the normative as a concern, like, is across both of those. And so if we think that they're, right, if we think of them both though as, conversations occurring, and there are conversations, let's say, both within theology, even, however, whatever sort of norms exist, let's say, within distinct theological traditions, they also change. And anthropology is also, as a tradition, has changed, and and part of the way it changes is through engagements with other kinds of thinking and other kinds of reasoning. So I wouldn't see it as a harnessing to the normative so much. I would think it on the sort of, the drawing sustenance from. It's a more positive, I understand. Not that there aren't risks involved, but I'm seeing it more from that sort of. Your hand is up, yes.
I guess I would love you to talk a bit
Marav
more.
Shohed.
Oh, sorry, Marav Shohed, Anthropology. I'd love you to talk a bit more about the directionalities of the interdependence, because so it struck me that your examples they have to do with birth, with creation, right? And to me it sounds like so it sounds very Levinasian that we should be responsive to the other, to the call of the other. But he also, Levinas at least, makes a distinction of suffering for and near suffering. And the suffering and pain that you described has much more to do with a kind of suffering for. But when we think, and forgive me, if we think of, for example, cancer suffering, care at the end of life, like where do we fully submit, and what are the limitations of this kind of orientation to submission? And also the interdependence, it still sounded like there is a hierarchy of the grandmother and the child and the God and the community. And so does it also go the other way? Does it go in multiple ways, or is there always an embedded hierarchy between the intersubjective and interdependent beings?
I wasn't trying to provide a single, maybe it came to sound like a kind of normative model here. Like, I can imagine all sorts of like arranged hierarchical configurations in which one might think about these sort of things. I don't think, like, I'm not sort of trying to outline prerequisites for a certain kind of recognition of relationality and independency. I could think, the question of hierarchy emerges differently within different kind of traditions of practice, I would think, right? And in some, like we think about a certain way in which hierarchy is problematized in many of our current practices and is entirely accepted in other practices we do. And that has shifted historically, and it's some part of our sort of attunement is that it was the place of differences of power within sort of structures of interaction, right? And so, if you think of old examples from Assad, like the piano, learning to play the piano, like you have a teacher and there's a hierarchy, and that you either submit to the authority of the piano teacher, and that's a condition for you learning the skill of piano, or you say, no, I'm not going to practice scales. I don't believe that. I'm going to do it my own way. So there you could say there's a certain kind of hierarchy, a certain sort of structure of authority that is an essential aspect of the conditions of learning, right? And you could think it's different structures of hierarchy and for different practices and so on. So I wouldn't be like, I'm not thinking about one.
Yeah, but
yeah.
Okay. So the theological model that you're presenting, as it so happens to be a more Abrahamic version where there is a supreme being and the hierarchy goes kind of in one direction. I work in Vietnam, for example, where that is not the assumption, where there's a multi-directionality of it. That doesn't mean that hierarchy is absent. In fact, it's all over the place, but it's what I call a kind of asymmetrical reciprocity, where you owe up, but you also owe, you kind of, as a lower being, you owe submission and respect to the higher, but you also then owe kind of yielding to the lower. And so that's a different kind of model of interdependence, I would say, than the theological one described
It is,
in this
but it's a recognizable one.
Right. Yeah. And so I guess I'm curious about the different forms of theology that that you're suggesting, are all of these different theologies, do they get us to the same place of interdependence? Or is there ways in which we need to be more clear about what kind of interdependence and what kinds of submissions?
Like you were describing in Vietnam, you said, right? Right? And you're describing how, I take it, one owes one's, one has a duty towards one's parents, let's say, right? And one obeys one's parents. And there's also another kind of that you have different, it sounds like you have sort of different conditions of relationship with different peoples and so on, right? So, and those are understood to be founded upon some kind of, some undergirding principles, or they're just part of a tradition that people inherit. So I'm not, that seems to me, like in the case of Sarah Matakis, we're talking about how, certainly, we're not talking about the divine there. She's talking about relationships between generations, and she's talking about the transfer of a certain kind of generational knowledge. There are hierarchical relations, as there are between the child and the grandmother and so on. And there are other hierarchies in society that mediate those relationships or something. I hear you almost asking a political question, like, are some hierarchies better than others or something? Is that right? A little bit? You're nervous about the theological here because it sounds like a particularly worrisome hierarchy. So I'm stretching the theological in a way, not to calm your worries or something. But in some ways, I want to think about it that I'm not just presupposing like the Abrahamic model or something, if that makes you nervous. I'm particularly not more nervous about Abrahamic models because, as people pointed out long ago, polytheists are as violent and hierarchical as any monotheist has been. And there's no real, and non-theists, no one has a monopoly on this, on being bad or something. And so, I hear, you're asking for a kind of political judgment, and that's a tough one. I don't know, I'm not sure where I would go with that, because, I feel it would be too quickly for me to say that, well, there's some sort of forms of, certainly I'm nervous about some forms of hierarchy, absolutely. Having had plenty of relationships, I can say, some forms of hierarchy work for me. So it's not like anything goes, but I'm not sure how much you can deduce from an abstract sort of model of hierarchy. Please.
So my name is Dylan. I'm a fourth-year cultural anthropology student in the department. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really excellent. And I think you've kind of alluded to this, or we've danced around. You mentioned South America. There was an introduction to De La Cadena's work in the beginning a little bit. And so I feel like this kind of opens up a moment to ask whether you feel like or have explored parallels between your own work and De La Cadena's work. And specifically, I'm thinking, at the end of Earth Beings, right? There's this kind of invitation that De La Cadena does a lot of work to build us up to saying, this understanding that, the indigenous community, right, in the Andes has with Earth Beings, this is kind of other relationship, right, than maybe, say, Christians would have with their God, right? But yet, that very fact, if it is mobilized in a political arena, can kind of disrupt the status quo. And so this becomes the moment that De La Cadena introduces like cosmopolitics. So she says that, indigenous forms of kind of practice or spirituality, if it's kind of connected to a political movement, may have the potential to do what Jacques Rancière talks about with the kind of disrupting the participle of the sensible, right? Or partition of the sensible, rather, and kind of creating this moment for kind of to annoy modernity, right? And this is building on Chakrabarty. And I just see parallels with that and the critique that, Assad has of modernity, that someone like Alistair McIntyre has of modernity. And so I'm inviting you to kind of think about, is there an overtly political dimension to these questions of embodiment that you're asking and theology, where this could be taken, say, into the political arena, like here, or right in the United States, and kind of, do you see any potential to disrupt the partition of the sensible here in the here and now in the U.S., or are you not willing to go there?
None at all, unfortunately, no. I'm very optimistic about the future. I mean, Assad notoriously sort of is rather refrains from making clear political, at least in a lot of the writings, sort of, and adopts a kind of, the principle of caution that we can't deduce too much from, and we're not really in a position to quite understand or put forward a kind of political viewpoint. And so he's always sort of pulling back from trying to elaborate what might be the political implications of the kind of positions that he's developed and so on. That doesn't mean there aren't political implications, and they don't intervene. But I think he understands more that his intervention is in a kind of intellectual arena. And in that intellectual arena, like, you can think about, like, Islam is a part of the structure of that intellectual arena, and he's certainly, intervened in that, and religion more broadly, and a sort of critique of the secular, we could say, is, and so, I think it's political, but not in a prescriptive way, outside of, let's say, within a kind of academic milieu. I think it would be hard pressed to kind of. I think Marisol de la Cadena has a more sense of the political potential of the kind of forms of life that she's excavating, and the way in which they can perhaps lead to disrupt political life, and I think you find in Sarah Matakis a little bit of, she wants to think about that. She wants to say that, right, on one hand, she's telling a kind of history of modernity in which the very practices she's describing are effaced and rendered illegible and so on. But she sees them as a latent potentiality that can be released through a kind of poetic practice. And not just sort of an intellectual poetic practice, but as a potentiality that lies within the sort of, within the traditions that remain the underbelly of life on the European periphery. And so she sort of theorizes a kind of potentiality there at the periphery of Europe, of those practices having a kind of agency, a latent agency that could be released in something. Not just by sort of intellectual thematization, but as part of lived, as part of lives. And she may be just being optimistic there. But I'm not really comfortable being very, thinking. I do think there are certainly, political stakes, but they're.
But do you think that, anthropology's engagement with theology rooted in certain ethnographic encounters, right, and certain fieldwork projects could produce maybe some deeper commentary on the kind of intersection of anthropology, theology, and kind of politics as it annoys modernity or kind of.
I think there are. Yeah, I do think that there's. I think of people like Zaid Debriou, Maria Zaid Debriou's book, which is like it thinks about the theology, but in a very politically engaged way. I think Valentina Napolitano, some of her work does as well. I think it's interesting, those are both on Catholic contexts. So yeah, I do think that's sure.
I heard a request for one more question under other.
I saw Heather had a hand up.
I'll defer if there's another question.
Well, I don't want to. Are you open
I'm open. Yeah, I'm not. No. If you have to leave, please leave. And
Heather and Kimberly, and then we'll
Thanks.
close.
I guess mine's somewhat similar. I mean, I find a lot of this resonating, as you mentioned, with Donna Haraway's work. A lot of feminist science studies is coming from a similar sort of predicament. How do we cultivate a certain mutuality of being or a certain way of being in order to solve things like a climate predicament, for example. But there's often the challenge of cultivating that sense beyond, does just the acknowledgement of this and the sort of cognitive or intellectual recognition that this is a way of being necessarily produce this? And so I was wondering if you had anything to say about the implications of this to our sort of academic practice and how we want to share knowledge of these sorts of ways of being, but are constrained by certain kind of institutional arrangements and stuff like that, and basically how where there are kind of opportunities, I guess, to better cultivate this outside of the field, but also in the way we share knowledge.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you answered your own question about, like, does our simply academic intellectual engagement with this transform the world? Certainly not, and I think you were implying that. And I guess I would think about sorry. I mean, at least I'm inclined to think, well, where might one not have recognized? One looks for sort of where such, we'll call them practices, may exist that we have tended not to recognize because we've skewed them through in other ways, and what if, and to see them differently and to be able to understand them differently. And I mean, we're thinking of our interventions as academics here, right? Because whatever else you do, but it seems to me that thinking about potentialities within life, not just in academic life, but outside of life, right, is what academics try to do, and try to think about what possibilities there are, and to sort of flesh them out in a way that, at least with the hope that that academia has some role in shaping some sort of entering into broader discussions, and it both responds to and also contributes to some kind of broader kind of reverberations, broader kind of movements. And I think it's hard not to say anything that isn't obviously grossly overstated, like, academics will change the world or something. Or you end up having to theorize, well, how do we think about the production of academic knowledge in relation to different sites of political concern? And I think it's different depending on where one is thinking about. And like if you think about climate change or something, you think like there's a wide range of academics who have been writing on it. Of course, the technologists have far more sway in terms of this. But sometimes there's like a few social scientists or humanities types who get involved in those conversations. And
I was wondering about the practice outside of the field, like our writing, our seminars, and whatever, whether or not.
Yes, would teach the new generations.
Whether or not they reinforce a certain kind of cogito intellectual way of thinking about knowledge and transferring knowledge. That is, and opportunities, I guess, to.
I want to hear more how you're thinking of doing that. One tries in one's classroom to like inculcate a certain kind of feel for things.
And, I ask because it feels like intellectually, you're institutionally constrained.
You feel institutionally constrained. I mean, a lot of anthropologists do things outside the institution too, but they do it in some other form. So.